Hey everybody, welcome back to Engaging the Phenomenon. And today we have a extraordinary discussion for you. We have two legends in the field of UFOs and much more. Actually, we have George Knapp and Colm Kelleher. So welcome, guys.
Hey, James, good to be with you.
Be with you.
Yeah, and I really appreciate your time and more so your contributions to the field at large. You guys have really done incredibly important work over the last several decades, really. So let's get right into it. And people may be familiar with the books, Hunt for the Skinwalker, and then following that, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. And Hunt for the Skinwalker actually instigated in this entire thing. So George, if you want to start off, how did that come to be?
Well, I'll take it back even further. In the 90s, Robert Bigelow, Las Vegas businessman, billionaire, who has spent more money on UFO research than perhaps any person in the history of the world, was frustrated. He had been providing money to people like Stan Friedman, John Mack, Linda Howe to do individual research projects. And he wanted to support the large UFO organizations, MUFON, CUFOS, FUFOR. So he put I think $1 million on the table and said, here, you don't have any resources. You're always complaining you need money to do investigations. Here's $1 million. All you got to do is get along. And of course they didn't, so he took it back and out of that frustration, he created something called NIDS, the National Institute for Discovery Science. This amazing science advisory board made up of people like Dr. Edgar Mitchell, Harrison Schmitt, the last man to walk on the moon. Edgar Mitchell, of course, the sixth man to walk on the moon, who was a U.S. senator at that time. Schmitt was valet, Kit Green, Hal Puthoff. That's the UFO sort of component of it. There was also a consciousness element to the Science Advisory Board that was equally impressive. And he went to do his own research. I was fortunate to be invited to speak at the first meeting of that amazing organization. A couple of days later, after it happened, I told Senator Harry Reid, a friend of mine, about it. He got an invitation to come to a later meeting that year, and he was hooked. He was hooked on UFOs and the larger issues there. That relationship, he and Bigelow, bore fruit many years later with the creation of BASS, the Bigelow Advanced Aerospace Space Systems subset of Bigelow Aerospace, and AAWSAP, the program that we're probably going to talk about today, that was a UFO and paranormal study investigation operated under the Defense Intelligence Agency. Because of that group that Bigelow had put together, NIDS, and the relationships that were established there with not only the Science Advisory Board, but with Harry Reid and Bob Bigelow, it led to all kinds of things that we're going to get into today, including the discussion of Skinwalker Ranch. That same year that NIDS launched, 1996, Bigelow had heard about this property in Utah where strange things were happening. There had been a couple of little local newspaper articles that were picked up by the wire services. The property came to his attention. He and I think John Alexander flew down to meet with the rancher, and the primary interest was UFOs. The Uinta Basin is a place that had been known for UFO activity for decades, maybe even much longer than that. And that's really what got Bigelow's attention. If there's this haunted ranch where UFOs are being seen on a regular basis in a fairly spectacular fashion, he was interested. So he flew down, not really knowing the full scope and depth and breadth of the strange phenomena that have been happening on that property and throughout the basin. But he met with the rancher, bought the property on the day that he got there. And then for the next 7.5 years, he had a team there, the NIDS team, including Colm, Eric Davis, folks like that, who were on the ground, boots on the ground, 24/7 for long stretches of time. They put in cameras, they did scientific studies, they tried to look for prosaic explanations for strange phenomena. They interviewed the family, the neighbors, the cops, the Indians. They did a real thorough job of trying to figure out this strange stuff that was going on. The longer they were there, the stranger it got. And that study had been kept quiet. They were there for 7.5 years. I was basically the only journalist allowed to know what NIDS was doing, but I couldn't report on it. So I would bug people like my good friend Colm about letting me go ahead and cut loose with some of this information. And eventually he talked Robert Bigelow into letting me do something. My first visits to the property were, I brought a cameraman along. We were going to produce a documentary, a film about the strange stuff. So we started doing interviews. Bigelow eventually changed his mind about that, killed the idea for the documentary. So all that footage that I had over those first couple of years from 2001 through 2004 or 5 was spiked. But the activity level for NIDS kind of went down. Whatever that phenomena was, this intelligence at the ranch, and we can get into specifics in a moment, sort of went underground. It got tired of being hunted. So there wasn't enough really activity to keep NIDS busy. And I think Bigelow was ready to shut the whole thing down, not sell the property, but shut it down. I argued that, well, look, let me write something about it, put something out, and maybe you could get ideas on where there are other hotspots that NIDS could investigate, which is what happened. I put out an article in the Las Vegas Mercury, a couple of pieces on it. They came out 20 years ago last month, November of 2002. This thing went all over the world. Boom, hit like an atomic bomb, spread all over the place. Suddenly there's people flooding into the Uinta Basin, UFO nuts, paranormal people, all kinds of crazy folks overrunning the property, all kinds of vandalism and trespassing and creating problems. And we did get information about other hotspots, but the active study by NIDS went away. However, Colm and I, because of the success of that article, we made the pitch to Mr. Bigelow to let us write a book about it, which told the story of the NIDS investigation of the ranch and the bigger picture of how it all fits into the UFO mystery and other phenomena. And we did. It was 17 years ago this month. Hunt for the Skinwalker was published. It landed with a thud, a boom. It's still reverberating. I think a lot of people thought we made it up, that it was a bunch of baloney, that we had some kind of deep, dark, ulterior motives, but we didn't. We just told the story of how it happened. The people who were on the ground there, what they saw, what they experienced. And that story, the phenomena that we had documented back then and that NIDS had documented, is still unfolding. It's changed, but it's still unfolding. That book, sometime later, was read by a guy named Dr. Jim Lukatsky, a rocket scientist, a brilliant man, double PhD, who had been working for the Defense Intelligence Agency for a long time. He shared it with other intelligence officials. We were told that book was very popular in the Green Zone in Iraq during the Iraq conflict. And a lot of those folks who were curious, is this real? Lukatsky eventually came back. He was interested in the phenomena at the ranch, whether it might have national security, national defense implications. He asked his bosses for permission to reach out to Bigelow. He asked Bigelow for permission to visit the property. They went together. And within, I think, 45 minutes of Lukatsky being on the property, he had a very unique, very strange experience that seemed to be tailored just for him. Colm can describe the event itself. He has this event, goes back to Washington, has the idea for a program that could study the ranch and the bigger picture about UFOs and related phenomena. He pitched it to Harry Reid, who got the money for it, $22 million, and a program known as AAWSAP was born. I'm aware of this that's going on. I don't have a clearance. I'm not allowed to know everything these guys are doing, but I'm aware of what they're doing. I just can't report on it and talk about it, and it drove me crazy. But we can get into what developed after that.
Yeah, and just really quick, and again, I don't know to what level you guys can answer this, but was Jim Lukatsky part of the experiencer study? Colm or George?
Experiencer study. What was that? Can you define that?
I mean, did they look at Jim's DNA? Did they do the MRI scan to see if he had the caudate attainment?
Well, yeah, that's something. There's no way I can because all of the samples that were taken over time from various individuals and all of the MRI imaging was done under confidentiality. So there's no way I can address that because we do have HIPAA issues involved with that. So I can't confirm that.
Sure. So we're at like the 5-year anniversary of the New York Times story. We all know that George had the story the whole time. He had he had Robert Bigelow on Coast to Coast talking about AAWSAP when it first started, and nobody picked up on it. And I had to go back and listen to those when the New York Times story broke, and I was just amazed that it was right there. But Colm, how do you feel about the aftermath of kind of where we are now, regarding the confirmations that Bigelow talked about after the New York Times article came out, and the progress we've seen, even though there's been some confusion as to ATIP and AAWSAP, generally speaking, how do you feel about how far we've come?
I think in general, since we are at the 5-year anniversary, I think the initial sort of breaking of the story did a tremendous service to the whole field. And I think breaking that story was a really landmark achievement. But there were obvious distortions in the detail regarding that story. But over time, I think the missing parts are being filled in. And I think our book, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, was published deliberately in order to fill in those gaps, so that people who chose to read it could add that to what actually was originally put out on the New York Times. And if you add A plus B, I think you can get the whole picture. The whole picture was that the AAWSAP program was the sort of $22 million program. There were distortions in the New York Times article, but I think over time it's been corrected, and all of what we did at AAWSAP was memorialized in that book. So if you add those two together, I think in general, we collectively moved the field forward. And I think Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, at the same time have done a tremendous push in making sure that in the halls of Congress, Senate, and Congress, that this message has been heard. Now, only part of the message has been heard, but there is a foot in the door. I think there's a lot of momentum going on behind the scenes right now, but I think the initial part of this, the release with the New York Times article, was a good thing. And I personally think 5 years later that in sum, all of what we did collectively as a group has made a difference.
I would add this, James. It's 5 years later. That story that was done by Ralph Blumenthal, Leslie Kean, Helene Cooper was incredibly important. It was monumentally important for the future evolution of this subject matter, just to break through. And you can see evidence of how unusual that was by what the New York Times has done recently. They've done recently what they've done for 60 years, which is to crap all over the UFO topic. For those three reporters to get this story on, to get it past their editors, to get it published, is an amazing feat, given the hostility that the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, CBS News, all those big shot media outlets have been incredibly hostile, but in particular the newspapers. So for them to get it published at all was amazing. They did get some things that were wrong. I think they did the best they could at the time for what they were allowed to know. There was so much more about the AAWSAP program, the real source of the $22 million, the real source of the largest UFO investigation ever funded by the US government. They got some things wrong about that, but they were not able to know the stuff that we knew about the program then. So they did the best they could. Later, 6 months later, the information from Lekatsky and some others came out, and I was able to release some of it. And Colm and I have documented it further with Dr. Lekatsky in our book. But they did the best they could at the time. And it's amazing that they were able to get it on at all. You look at this pre-bunking piece that the New York Times did a couple of months ago. That's typical of what the New York Times has done. I suspect that after this event from Friday on the 5-year anniversary, the Pentagon has this news event with select group of media folks, including the guy, Julian Barnes, who'd written this pre-bunking article. We're going to get more of what is typical of the New York Times from Julian Barnes, or whatever the next piece is that no evidence of space aliens. That's the headline that I expect. to hear, because the Times has been hostile to the topic. And the fact that Ralph and Leslie and others were able to get a story or two on is amazing. They did get some things wrong. We've corrected it. There was an AAWSAP program. AAWSAP got the $22 million. It was operated under the DIA. The guy in charge of it was Jim Lukatsky. There was later an ATIP program, and Lou Elizondo was in charge of that. I think there are a lot of people who'd like to exploit the differences in those two stories, put us at loggerheads with our version of what happened and their version of what happened, and they're not at odds. The story is seamless. If you look at the big picture that we told in our book, and some of the stories that I have reported over the years, there's not a conflict there. But I think there are those who would like to exploit it and try to make one where one doesn't exist.
Yeah, I agree. I think the people that are most likely doing that are not well intended in what they're doing, and they know it. But again, highly intriguing was that AAWSAP, in regards to the ATIP name, or as you have said, moniker, Colm, is that there, Senator Harry Reid tried to get SAP status, and you were able to do an article on that, George, and release that memo where Senator Harry Reid wanted AAWSAP to get special access program status. And was that potentially to also find other possible current or previous UFO classified programs?
Yeah, I think it was, we reached a stage where we were accumulating so much data under the AAWSAP program that it was becoming really obvious that for a whole host of reasons that we needed to go into a special access program investigation. And part of that was to have access to United States government information that had already been gathered. I mean, one example that we talk about in the book is that we visited with the AFOSI, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. And, that was a sort of a signature moment, because that actually occurred before this whole drive to get SAP status. But it really underlined it for us, because the bottom line from our discussions with AFOSI is that the only way that we could communicate was if AAWSAP had SAP status. I mean, there was really no way around that. So that was a very good example of an arm of the United States government who we knew had a lot of data over decades on the UFO topic, basically saying, look, you guys don't have the secret handshake yet. You need to go get that secret handshake. So the initiative that Senator Reid undertook was an exploration into that whole world. But we knew that we had to do that in order to get further information. Also, there was an element that was going on within the Pentagon where our program was getting increasingly sort of well known throughout the corridors in the Pentagon. There was already quite a lot of pushback against the idea of investigating UFOs. There was a lot of nervousness within various parts of the Pentagon. And so it was deemed judicious for us to go ahead and get SAP status in order to protect various parts of the AAWSAP program. So there were multiple reasons for going after that. And obviously that memo, when it was unfortunately leaked, as we had described in the book, it caused the exact opposite of what we intended, which was that memo was leaked to multiple different departments within the Pentagon. And there was a lot of naysayers that were energized and activated in order to try to kill this program. So that memo achieved exactly the opposite of what the intent was, because it was leaked, and it was leaked to people who were very, very nervous about this program.
I just add this, the very first conversation I ever had about UFOs with Senator Harry Reid was about reverse engineering, these allegations of things that were being taken apart out in the Nevada desert in order to figure out how they worked and to see if we could duplicate that technology. And at the time, I'm sure it sounded preposterous, more preposterous even than now, because it was so far out there. But Senator Reid took an interest in it. And I think that planted the seed. And then years later, as he is getting briefings and having conversations with people like Robert Bigelow and others about what the AAWSAP guys are doing, you know, those stories keep bouncing back to him, hearing about the possibility that there's alien technology somewhere that's being taken apart by these big aerospace companies to figure out if we can duplicate the technology and gain an advantage in terms of national security capabilities. He was hearing that stuff as well, you know, and of course, Colm and Lakatsky and the people they were working with, people who are deep inside. You keep hearing those things over and over. That was one of the goals of trying to turn it into a special access program is, can we get to see the goodies? I mean, it's right there in that New York Times story that the special accommodations had been created at the Bigelow plant in Las Vegas in the event that they ever got any of that stuff, that they'd be able to protect it, analyze it, figure it out. That was part of the contract. That was part of the deal from the beginning. So I think one of Senator Reid's goals and the goals of Colm and Robert Bigelow and others who were advising him was by creating a special access program that they might be able to finally knock at the door and have the door open. As we dictate in the book, though, they got quite a different reception when they tried to ask about the other special access programs, UFO investigations or reverse engineering. Where's the goodies? Where's the bodies? The door was slammed in their face. Now, I guess we don't spell it out in clear enough language in the book for people to understand it because they seem to have missed that. But these guys really went after it. And they got the door slammed in their face, not because it doesn't exist, but because it does exist somewhere, and they're not allowed to see it.
Well, and again, the only way you can get the door slammed on you is if there's something behind the door. And, you know, again, shout out to Hermetic Penetrator and Omega Point for putting together Loose Threads. I hope people read that. I'll link it in the description where, you know, they kind of categorize this whole journey of people like Hal and the people that were involved in NIDS and others in that proximity that were trying to get to the center of the labyrinth of these, these UFO programs that have been existing and probably still do exist. Is it fair to say that those programs, those SAP programs that AAWSAP was potentially trying to gain access to further their work and research are what we have been calling recently the UFO Legacy Programs?
They were certainly part of what we were going after, but that was only one part of the whole picture. The legacy programs, I think it was common knowledge with anybody who was working in this field behind the scenes that these legacy programs existed. But it was, as George said, it was a case of breaking down the door or getting involved. But there were also a lot of different avenues that we were trying to follow in terms of protecting this program under special access program status. I mean, that was a very big part of what we were looking at, because once we were sort of exposed to the light within the Pentagon, there was a lot of folks that were really intent on shutting this program down. So there was an element of protection, and most special access programs are involved in that aspect of protection also. So it's not only gaining the information, which obviously was a big part of what we were after, but it was also the protection.
And what else is there beyond legacy programs? There's more to it than that?
For our particular program, we were focused not only on the hardware, but we were also focused on medical aspects of the topic. So we were looking at delving deeper and deeper into medical aspects of the topic, including all of these rumors regarding quote unquote alien technology, biology of unknown origin, all of that. So it wasn't only nuts and bolts that we were sort of focused on. We were also focused on biology. And that's a completely different sort of avenue to follow.
So that's separate from the legacy programs?
Well, it's inherent in the legacy programs, but it's not usually focused on. And again, you know, I would reiterate that all of the people who were involved in these programs behind the scenes, it was pretty well common knowledge that these legacy programs existed. However, it was a question of, you know, encroaching into that domain, and it was extremely difficult to get beyond, you know, the first level of barriers.
Yeah, and George, you know, Jeremy Corbell had this amazing quote in I think of 2018, right after the Hunt for the Skinwalker documentary came out. He said, you know, there are, you know, secret UFO programs. I'm paraphrasing here, and I believe that at least 4 of them will come out, and I will be proven right. And that 4 also correlates with a quote that we were able to get from Bernard Heisch, talking about 4 special access programs involving UFOs that had funding up into the billions, which is an incredible correlation. And, you know, after Jeremy was on Phenomenon Radio, you went on there, and I think Linda or John, probably Linda, asked you about those 4 programs, and your response was something like, I don't know how you got that out of them, but yes. So where does that come from?
I can't tell you, but I'll say that I think it will be proven to be true eventually. I'll just say this. Look, here's a program, the one we're talking about now, AAWSAP, that really hasn't seeped into the public consciousness. Somehow Congress, it hasn't dawned on them, the light bulb hasn't gone off about in their heads either. They're asking questions at their one lone public hearing about ATIP. Was there anything else? Well, we've documented there was something else. In fact, it was the biggest UFO program that we know of for sure. There are rumors and allegations about something much bigger. And if you believe that there are objects of alien origin that have been stashed away and studied, then yeah, somebody's funding that to a large degree over the years. But here's something we know for sure was funded. AAWSAP had 50 full-time investigators. Compare that to like Project Blue Book, which everybody knows about. Their job was to explain this stuff away, and they had a much smaller staff. These guys had 50 full-time investigators who were boots on the ground, traveled all over the world, gathered files from other governments and other private sources and put it together. They created the world's largest UFO database. You know, we saw that announcement from the Pentagon meeting with reporters talking about a couple of 100 cases. Whoop-de-doo. These guys had 200,000 cases in this data warehouse that they put together, 200,000 UFO cases. And it's not just stories of lights in the sky. As Colm mentioned, one of the main focuses of the AAWSAP program, the BASS investigation, was the physical effects, harmful effects that happen in these close encounter cases. Pilots, other kinds of witnesses who get close to this technology, bad things happen to them. You know, we've seen only one report, the DIRD report that Kid Green wrote, that was made public. There's so much more that has not been made public. And in fact, I'm not sure it ever will be made public because so much of it is so sensitive. These guys, when they're investigating and interviewing people who've had these dramatic, often devastating medical consequences, in order to get the information out of them, you have to tell them, hey, we're not going to make this public. You know, it took us 14 months to get approval by the Pentagon for what we wrote in that first book. And there's so much more that hasn't been made public of a highly sensitive nature. You know, when I see these debunking kind of things in the Times and other media, how there's no proof of space aliens, it's so disheartening in a sense, because the kind of work that Colm and his colleagues did to get to the bottom of this, if they'd been allowed to continue. I mean, AAWSAP lasted 27 months. It was supposed to be at least 5 years. If they'd been allowed to be a special access program to continue, we might have some solid answers by now. But we don't, we don't. Now, where those other legacy programs are housed, I can't say for sure. I can say I'm pretty confident that there is hardware, that there are machines and materials of unknown origin that are in the hands of defense contractors, whether or not our government will ever get them back. Is there a paper trail that establishes we gave it to them so that they can analyze it, figure it out every couple of years and break it out of the hangar and try to figure out how it works? I don't know. I know that if I were them and I had it, I wouldn't give it back to us. But it's going to be a fun couple of years. The next couple of years are going to be a lot of fun as we see where Congress's investigation, where Arrow and other entities go in trying to get to the bottom of these mysteries. I'm sorry if I went on a tangent there.
No, it's great, George. You always have a very important insight to add. And, what makes you confident that these 4 programs will see the light of day? And is it related to the immunity language that was granted in the NDAA?
Well, I think I'm confident that some of it will come out because there are people, whistleblowers, who are lining up to tell the story. And, I don't know how far Colm wants to go, but there are colleagues of his that know so much more. And not just the generic story of we've got crash saucers stashed somewhere. They know where. They know where this stuff is, at least where it was pretty recently. And I wouldn't be surprised that there has already been testimony before members of Congress about those legacy programs, about the goodies and where they might be stored. I think they probably got an earful already. And then when you have the protections signed into law, there's a lot of folks lining up to tell some stories. I think they're going to be able to find it. I think they're going to be able to at least find some of it.
Colm, please add context to that, or as far as you can
as we know, the National Defense Authorization Act was recently signed, but that the real kicker for this is the appropriations legislation that needs to go through, and so a lot will depend on how much funding is allocated to this program, and that right now is really up in the air. I mean, I would say that once if there are sort of bona fide authorization programs that are passed and the president signs, then I will be an awful lot more confident in all of this language having teeth, because I think there's so much up in the air, and there's also a tremendous level of pushback against these programs seeing the light of day. So I think there's going to be a real balance in the next 6 months as this whole juggernaut goes forward. I mean, are we going to have continuing resolutions again, or are we going to have a fully funded set of programs? We don't know that yet. And I think a lot of this will depend on that. And also, it will depend on how aggressive Congress, various members of Congress get in making sure this happens. Because remember, there are decades of precedent for these programs never seeing the light of day. So I'm basically an optimist, and I would say maybe there's enough momentum in order to make this happen. But right now, I think the jury is still out.
I'll add this. The Pentagon will have to be dragged kicking and screaming into coming up and coming clean on this stuff. They are already dragging their feet, as Colm has pointed out, and as others have pointed out. They don't want to give this stuff up. That ridiculous event Friday with a couple of noted debunker media types, it flies in the face of what they're saying. The word salad they're tossing out about wanting transparency. If not for the New York Times story 5 years ago, making it acceptable for other mainstream media to go ahead and dig into this, Congress would not have come out of its closet and embraced this topic as it has. New York Times story made it acceptable for other media to cover it. That gave cover to members of Congress to ask questions, to have closed door briefings. It's important for the public, James, for your audience, to stay engaged, to keep the feet to the fire of members of Congress, because something else comes along, some big issue that distracts them. If they don't stay on this, the military is all too happy to drop it. They don't want this stuff to come out. They don't want to answer questions about it. You look at the evidence of the Air Force. Where have they been? We know they're a storehouse of information and evidence and videos and and other kinds of materials over the decades. And they're completely silent on this. We don't hear anything from them unless Congress makes them come to the table. It's not going to happen. So it's important for this public to stay engaged, to keep Congress's feet to the fire, because otherwise the military will happily let this drop.
Yeah, and also I should add that Secretary of the Air Force Frank Kendall came out several months ago and basically said, until we, the Air Force, see some evidence that there is a there, we're not going to expend an awful lot of energy on this whole new initiative. So we already know that the Air Force has a tremendous amount of information and legacy information also. So for the Secretary of the Air Force to draw a line in the sand like that a few months ago just shows me, for example, that there will be quite a lot of resistance in bringing this out of the darkness into the light. So the Air Force is a very, very, very powerful element of this whole thing. The other part of this is the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. And during the AAWSAP program, we had a lot of information that was going on with OUSDI in terms of how recalcitrant they were and how completely opposite they wanted in terms of information getting forward. So we have both OUSDI and S now, as well as the Air Force. We have two very powerful 800-pound gorillas in this equation, and we have to surmount that whole thing in order for this to happen.
Yeah, and even at our event in New York City, just at the beginning of the month, Christopher Mellon had said that he couldn't believe how the United States Air Force was stiff-arming the Congress, and the language had to be adapted because the Air Force was saying, "Oh, aerial, that if it's in space, we don't have to contribute that information because it's not aerial," and so they're very they're fighting back hard, and it's been an issue. And I do want to get into that aspect of it also with the pushback and a group that is involved with that. But before we do, I just have two quick inquiries regarding possibly legacy programs, probably. And Colm or George, whoever wants to take this first, I would like to hear from both of you. You are both close colleagues with one of my friends, Dr. Eric Davis, and we all know about the Wilson Davis memo, the meeting that happened in Las Vegas in 2002. When was the first time that you guys had heard about that meeting, and when was the first time that you actually read the actual memo?
I'm gonna let Colm take that one.
When's the first Colm, the first time that you heard about the meeting and the first time that you read the actual 15 pages of the memo?
I was aware of it many, many years ago, but I can't put a date on it. I was aware, but most of what happened with the Wilson Davis memo happened after Eric Davis left the National Institute for Discovery Science. And so, I mean, we're all part of a quote unquote invisible college. So there is a lot of information transfer that is highly confidential between different members of this quote unquote invisible college. So I can say that I was aware, but I'm not going to say any more than that.
George?
Well, I'll say a little bit more than that. I was aware of it too, not that long after it happened, and I did not read the memo. I didn't see it until years later, but that discussion floated around. Eric had left NIDS, I think, 4 or 5 months prior, but he was still working for Hal Puthoff. That was still a pretty close group of people. They all were they had been through the fire together and trying to figure this mystery out. So there is a flow of information that maintains for that group and a little bit larger group regardless of where they're working and who they're working for. So that story had been out. And I'll just tell you, I think I'm pretty sure that the meeting really did happen. That was discussed among a very small circle of friends, that it was real, that Eric's notes were accurate, that he really did meet with Wilson, and that I know where it happened, and I think it's real. It's true. Eric didn't make it up. It's not a movie script. It's real. The fact that it leaked out after Dr. Edgar Mitchell died is unfortunate, but it happens.
Well, I mean, unfortunate or not, I mean, it made it into the congressional record now. You can go on the congressional website and it has the 15 pages with Dr. Eric Davis and Vice Admiral Tom Wilson, who was the deputy director of the DIA, went on to be the director of the DIA after he behaved and stopped asking questions about it, presumably, even though if you take into the notes that he was threatened if he continued to pursue the issue. And I can understand why he would not want to publicly vouch for that meeting for legal and safety reasons. So, God bless the guy. But in relation to that, in those same set of documents that were released from Edgar Mitchell's files after he had passed away, there was also an email thread with Kit Green, Hal Puthoff, and others regarding an alien autopsy video. And, I mean, there was things in that thing that were way more interesting than the Santilli film. You have Dr. Kit Green saying that he was briefed in the Pentagon 3 times in the late 90s and shown pictures of autopsies by people in the Pentagon. How I don't understand how that is not like picked up on. That's incredible. Number one. And I don't know if you probably can't speak to any of that, but George, I want to start with you here. In that email thread, there's something mentioned by Dr. Hal Puthoff about a group called Zodiac. Have you ever heard of it?
Yes, I've heard of it. I'm just not ready to go into that, though. Yeah, I've heard of it. I think it's real. But I'm not able to talk about it right now.
I know you can't really get into it, but could you offer any context to the audience listening of your understanding of what it might be?
Well, sort of something akin to MJ12, an idea that we had of what MJ12 would be, and those are documents are highly controversial even now. Whether or not it really existed is unknown. This is a similar sort of an organization that's been described in high levels of UFO lore for a long time. If I had to give an opinion about whether it's real, I'd say, yeah, I think it's real.
And Colm, can you say anything about Zodiac?
Beyond what George has said, no. I think George summarized it really well.
And George, and again, whether you can answer or not, do you think that is an actual name of a program or group, or is that something used as a cover?
Yeah, I suspect it's not an official name. I don't think it's going to pop up in a document somewhere. I think it's kind of a loose sort of an unofficial name for a group and an organization, but I could be wrong. I mean, I'm not a member. They don't let me in. So maybe I'd like to. Colm, put in a good word for me.
So, and in regards to that, and we're talking about informal names of groups, and I wanted to touch on who killed AAWSAP, and within those kind of conversations, you hear the name. Another informal name that's not an actual name of a program is the Collins Elite. So, was that something that was that people were aware of during AAWSAP?
I can say that during the AAWSAP and in the aftermath of AAWSAP, there were several people that were involved that were looking to a different organization from the Defense Intelligence Agency in order for Senator Reid to execute a separate program. And during those events, there was multiple times when there were various interferences that were put out, and they were tied to this so-called Collins Elite. Some of the people who were trying to interfere with the creation of a new program did have those affiliations with what was loosely termed the Collins elite. And so there were elements within various parts of the Pentagon that were tied to various religious beliefs that were interfering deliberately in the furtherance of what AAWSAP had started and what AAWSAP was hoping to continue.
I'd add this, James, is that, the idea, when I first heard the idea that people were objecting to continuation of AAWSAP or studying UFOs and places like Skinwalker Ranch, that they objected to it on religious grounds. They wanted the program killed because they felt the phenomena itself was demonic or satanic. I thought that was preposterous. What an outrageous thing to say. If you're a high up in the Pentagon or these intelligence agencies, you're basing national defense policy on your religious beliefs. It's outrageous. And as time has gone on, I've thought about it a little bit more, and we don't really know what the phenomena at the ranch is. And to suggest that we don't know that it's alien or interdimensionals or extraterrestrial or crypto-terrestrial or whatever it is, can't really rule demonic out. So looking in retrospect to the concerns that these guys had, maybe they weren't all that far off the mark. The fact is, though, that whatever the source of the phenomena is, whatever the nature of it is, not studying it is not a good way to make it go away. Trying to ignore it doesn't mean it no longer exists. What these guys at AAWSAP did was remarkable. I mean, they had tremendous courage to go ahead and follow the evidence wherever it led. And yeah, now, after all these years after their program was disbanded, it is now somewhat respectable to go ahead and investigate UFOs, hardware, craft from other worlds, whatever it is. It's acceptable for media to report on it, acceptable for Congress to talk about it, but good gosh, don't talk about anything any weirder. You don't want to get into paranormal, poltergeist type stuff like what they saw at the ranch, or Bigfoot, or creatures, or the hitchhiker phenomena following intelligence agents home and messing with their families. That's too weird. We can't study it. I can understand that when the evidence from AAWSAP, when these reports from BAS started going to the DIA and they circulate a little bit, that it would be very upsetting to these intelligence professionals, that they'd wonder, holy crap, what if this ends up on the front page of the New York Times? We'll be terribly embarrassed. We got to knock this off before it becomes a scandal. Well, yeah, it's scary to investigate it. These guys had the courage to go ahead and, as I said, follow the evidence where it led. You can't just solve this mystery about UFOs by studying lights in the sky. I was thinking about it. It's like I'm playing with my cats with a laser pointer. They never quite catch up to it. That's how UFO people are going to be if all they're doing is chasing lights in the sky and radar returns and things of that sort. You're never going to figure it out unless you look at the big picture, which is what AAWSAP was doing. If they'd been allowed to continue, we might have had some answers by now. So on one hand, I'm encouraged by all the progress that's been made over the past 5 years since those time stories came out, since our book came out. But there are people that would love to shut it down, call them Collins elite, whatever you want to call them, for a variety of different reasons. They'd like it to go away.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about the Collins elite was, again, they may not be entirely wrong in the idea of what we may call demonic force, right? Or in some cases, angelic, right? Daemon in Greek, which are highly advanced spiritual entities that in modern vernacular, we would just say that they're extra dimensional and they have the ability to step out of space-time. It's just a different terminology. And with that terminology comes baggage. So, it's just a difference in approach of like, okay, if it's here, why would you just ignore it rather than trying to study it? You'd be better off if you were well informed on the issue. And I spoke to a UFO researcher who had since passed, and he told me he had a mentor named Chuck Misler who was part of this Collins elite. And if you listen to the guy talk, again, he has some stuff where he's talking about Bible literature and stuff, but he's talking about hyperdimensional physics. And this guy's a military defense contractor. He's right where you'd expect that to be. And some people have brought up there's some kind of series called The Family that talks about this stuff. And there's a group called the Family Research Council. I don't know if that rings any bells for you, George.
No. Sorry.
Okay. Um, so, oh man, there's so much I really want to get into it, you guys, with about these subjects. One thing I did want to touch on, the hitchhiker effect. Someone posed the idea as, the hitchhiker effect is this phenomenon has the ability to maybe entangle with you quantumly, right? Quantum entanglement, where it can, follow you in that sense once you interact with it. And that's very prevalent in contact literature over the decades. And even in what Jacques Vallée had discussed in the Invisible College book with Dr. X, except Dr. X's hitchhiker effect could, even though he had physical effects, arguably there were some positive hitchhiker effects. So that's one aspect. Another is also that, the question of, is it possible to obtain the hitchhiker effect digitally if you were just reading about it, or something to that nature?
Well, there's a lot of anecdotal emails and texts that we've got over, since the book was published, saying exactly that I was reading the book, and suddenly there were sort of paranormal events that were happening around me in the next 24 hours. But there's a lot of anecdotal reports like that. But ultimately, this has to be studied in a completely rigorous, comprehensive way. And the data that AAWSAP gathered with all of the different individuals on the ranch, and that some individuals off the ranch who are bringing stuff home with them, and then having all of these bizarre paranormal events erupting around them. You could talk about there's something, on somebody's shoulder that's manipulating their perception. You could also talk about the brain as a filtering device, which goes all the way back to William James over 100 years ago. So on Aldous Huxley and all of the more recent, theories regarding how the brain and consciousness are linked. All of that stuff is right in the target of a very, very substantial research project if it ever gets off the ground. Now, I'm encouraged by the original language associated with the, that's still in the National Defense Authorization Act regarding effects of UFOs on people. Because once you start opening that door, you get into medical effects, and then you get into psychological effects, and then you get into paranormal effects. I mean, there's a sort of an unbroken chain that AAWSAP discovered, and anybody who's looking at effects of UFOs on people, and that are not just confining themselves to sensor-driven data, will inevitably stumble upon this whole thing. And the hitchhiker effect falls out of that unbroken chain. So I am partially optimistic that eventually this whole series of data that AAWSAP uncovered will be uncovered in a future program. But it's not going to happen next year or the year after. I think there's a lot of resistance, as we were talking about earlier, even to the nuts and bolts aspect of this program ever seeing the light of day. So whether or not it actually survives the Air Force and OUSDI, but inevitably, if this study is undertaken in any way, a rigorous way, and medical effects are included, ultimately this whole hitchhiker effect will have to be addressed.
I would add this is that, it's weird stuff, James. Obviously it's weird. And, we've taken all kinds of crap as a result. AAWSAP, once it started sending these reports about things that were happening at the ranch, things that were happening to investigators, they start taking crap as well. It's too darn weird. We put out our book, and oh my gosh, these guys are wasting Pentagon money on studying poltergeists. Well, no one was studying poltergeists. Colm and his colleagues were not there at the ranch to investigate ghosts. They were there to look at UFOs and to figure out the national security implications of where these things were from and the technology that was used. But in connection with that study, they inevitably came into contact with something else, something far weirder. They weren't investigating poltergeist. They were investigating things that were poltergeist-like, that just happened to be in the proximity to UFO events, and trying to understand the relationship there. You know, people have a lot of fun with the hitchhiker idea, but it's real. It happened. It happened to all of us to one degree or another. People who spent a lot of time on the ranch took things home. I know for the first 10 years that I was visiting the property, I brought things home on purpose, you know, rocks and bits and pieces of this and that, because I wanted to engage with it, and nothing happened to me until it did. You know, it didn't happen to me, it happened to my wife. And I think the same thing had happened with Colm and with Robert Bigelow. And for others who we describe in the book, we don't use their real names. For others, I mean, it's 10, 12 years later, it's still happening to them. They don't like it. It's not something pleasant. It's not a funny little poltergeist that Casper the Ghost in their home. It's frightening, it's upsetting. It continues to sort of mess with their minds a full decade later. But it's real, it happened. And you're not going to figure out the UFO mystery until you figure out all different aspects of it. And that's one of them.
Yeah. And, you know, Jacques Vallée and Dr. Eric Davis co-authored an amazing paper. I'm just going to call it the 6-layer model, because I can't pronounce the actual name, which I know was applied to AAWSAP and is an ingenious manifesto regarding contact and the effects of contact and how to study and inquire about anomalous phenomena. I think it's a brilliant paper. If I can, I'm going to link it in the description. And I actually didn't tell you guys, but we had planned an interview a little while ago. We weren't able to do, and actually something had occurred to me. Something happened to me, which I had not told you, George. Maybe I'll tell you off the air or something, but it was involved with that. You know, and I'm somebody who's an experiencer, and I've had plenty of positive experiences, but I understand I've had some experiences that were not so positive, that in my own estimation, off of gauging all my different experiences, it seemed to be a different type of phenomenon than I experience with UFOs regularly. And again, that could be a deception or manipulation. I don't know, but if I were to intuit it, I would say it felt very different, and came at me a different way. But
I would just like to add this: if we would like to be able to market our book by saying, buy the book, have a hitchhiker experience. That'd be a great sales technique. I wish we had more evidence to make that argument. You know?
Yeah, I mean, well, and again, is that something people want? And I'll get into this of. Right. Well, and here's the thing. There are in contact literature and in my own experience, you know, we'll say something with CE5, right? And that term has been muddied and destroyed by its creator, unfortunately, because of their conduct in the field, and personally. But the idea of contact modalities is a very real thing. And sometimes there are what we can call positive effects, right? People sometimes, they have a UFO experience, they have a paradigm transformation, a spiritual awakening, boosted psychic phenomena, boosted psychic potentials. So these all things occur, that you have the positive and the negative. So I just to throw it out there, that idea, I'm saying CE5 because people will be familiar with it, forget who coined the term. It's been in the literature for millennia, the idea of contact modalities, from shamans to Rama and Sixto Paswells in South America, who were doing the same exact thing in the 1970s. They got amazing video footage. So what are your ideas? We'll start with you, Colm, on CE5 and contact modalities.
Well, ultimately, you know, this whole topic needs to be broadened out into quote unquote consciousness, human consciousness, if you want to use that term, is probably the target of the UFO contact experience. So human consciousness in our sort of everyday life is limited by, you know, our experiences. So the whole CE5 paradigm points us in the direction of human consciousness, and the way I think increasingly different people in mainstream science are starting to look at human consciousness. People like Jeffrey Kripal, people like Donald Hoffman, you know, people like Edward Kelly at University of Virginia. They're all beginning to sort of look at consciousness as being an awful lot more than the result of biochemical trafficking of the brain. And, you know, the paradigm that has happened, the so-called physicalist paradigm that has reigned supreme for the last 100 years plus, you know, essentially the bottom line there is that consciousness is an emergent property of biochemical trafficking in the brain. If you reverse that whole thing and you look at, you know, people like, you know, Federico Fahin, who's the inventor of the microchip at Intel, you look at people like that who are broadening this whole concept of consciousness. UFOs fit beautifully into that whole sort of new paradigm, because, you know, the way sort of human consciousness operates, the way perception operates at the human level, UFOs lie outside that whole you could call it a bubble. Outside that bubble, UFOs can come and go, just like you know, the other great mystery that we've been studying for quite a while, the survival of consciousness after death. That sort of level of consciousness exists outside this bubble also, this small bubble that we operate on a daily basis, in which we pay our mortgages and we operate, you know, we drive around in our vehicles. But outside that bubble lies the two biggest mysteries that we are contending with. That is the UFO topic and the survival of human consciousness after death. And so I would say, you know, eventually, in terms of rigorous scientific study, this level of consciousness that is becoming more and more mainstream eventually will produce fruit. So I guess that's my 2 cents.
I would add this is just, I always feel so lucky when I'm on a program with Colm, just to know the guy and to be allowed to know, you know, the people that he's worked with all these years, that's starting with NIDS and then into BAS and now into BICS. You know, you think about NIDS, this is 1995, 96 when Bigelow's putting it together. People remember NIDS as a UFO organization, but it wasn't. It was two organizations in one. One was to figure out extraterrestrial or UFO alien contact. What's the deal on that? And the other half was consciousness. Do we survive physical death? What's the nature of consciousness? All those years ago, he's looking at having those two topics being considered by one organization. Now, eventually, the UFO side sort of took over, and the consciousness part of it went away. But all those years ago, he was looking at, he and his team, Colm, his most trusted guy, were looking at those twin mysteries and how they relate to each other. These days, we hear consciousness tossed around in UFO circles as a buzzword, and people have no freaking idea what the hell it means or how it relates to the phenomena, the topic at all. But it does. It's not an accident that NIDS became BAS, and they considered consciousness and UFOs and all the phenomena that are associated at the same time. And now that Bigelow has moved on to create BICS, the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies. He hasn't turned his back on UFOs. It's not like he's not interested in it anymore, but he and Colm are taking it to the next level. Is that pursuit of consciousness, that it exists independent of brain processes. That's the whole shebang. That's the big Megillah. That's the big question mark for all of us. Do we go on? How do we get here? Do we go on? And how do we relate to other consciousness in the universe? And it, you know, it's so much fun. It's so much fun to know these guys, to be privileged to get a little bit of what they're working on, and it's just changed my life. I know, just knowing them.
Yeah, and again, I could speak to that personally because I've had things that are akin to a near-death experience, which I call trauma-induced out-of-body experience and contact. And the chances of having both of those as frequent in your life are, the odds are, they don't
Right.
make sense. But again, at our event in December, we had Sharon Hewitt-Rawlett speak at our event, and she's involved with BICS. And she, was one of the contestant runner-ups and wrote an amazing paper, which is actually more like a heavy book on the subject. But yeah, I think very much, I often say that the UFO and UAP represent a bridge between physics and metaphysics, because you here have a physical object that is operating and demonstrating it can be tracked to some extent on gun camera footage, radar, sonar, satellites, and so on. Yet it's performing feats that we would consider metaphysical. And that really gets me into the idea of, both Hal Puthoff's Ultra Terrestrials paper and very much so Jacques Vallée's control system, where it's like, what are we really dealing with? It seems physical. We seem to have materials. We seem to have crafts. Yet there is this component of it that is just way beyond us. Hyper spatial, hyperdimensional. Is it one and the same thing? Are we looking at different phenomenon or phenomena? It just, again, like you said, George, it's a privilege to be able to speak with you guys, who are not just like, oh, look, there's a UFO, we tracked it on radar. We can actually go into the depth of it. And I think that's where the conversation needs to be. I think that's where the conversation needs to go. And that's something that my colleague, J. Christopher King, and I are doing with some of these conferences to really facilitate that conversation openly, because I think the field is ready for it. Now that we have confirmation of UAP, okay, let's really get into it then. Let's go to the depth of the matter, because that's where the answers are going to be. And as Dr. Gary Nolan would say, the answers, you're going to find the breakthroughs in the anomalies. You're not going to find the breakthroughs in, oh, wow, we tracked it on radar going at this speed. You have to really get into the depth of it to make the breakthroughs, both in fundamental understanding, but also in everything else, the physics of it, right? If you don't go into the deeper territory, you're not going to get it. There are a few kind of quick questions I wanted to be able to get to. Man, I know we have limited time here. Let me just bring it up. Let's do like a fire round of quick responses over here. MyLabs, military abductions, black helicopters. What's the word on that, Colm?
I personally have never encountered any credible evidence of this. It may exist, but in terms of the programs that we looked at, both NIDS and AAWSAP, we have never come across hard evidence for military abductions. I'm not saying they don't exist. It's just that we have never come across evidence, hard evidence. We've come across a lot of stories and anecdotes, but we've never come across any hard evidence.
Black helicopters, yes, though. Colm,
right.
One of the things he did for BASS and for NIDS was looking at mutilation cases, animal mutilations, not just cattle, all over the West. And they did have a lot of reports of black helicopters. And Colm wrote a book called Brain Trust. A lot of folks have picked up on that now, that the idea that there is another level of mutilators out there who've been carving up animals for their own nefarious purposes, separate from the truly anomalous phenomena that I think we both agree is legit in its own right.
Okay. And yeah, exactly. The black helicopters thing, it seems to be without a doubt, at least that some people that have had UFO encounters are being monitored possibly, or who knows what beyond that. The idea, okay, UAP and missing people in national parks, is that a thing, Colm?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Dave Paulides has really come out with some very intriguing evidence However, you've got to really sort of merge a bunch of different databases that have never been merged in order to fundamentally answer that question. AAWSAP created, as George said, very, very large data warehouse where UAPs, multiple different levels of UAP. Dave Paulides has created his own data set. I'm not aware that those two data sets have been merged in a rigorous way in terms of analysis. And until that happens, I think, it's a very intriguing question, but to answer it is doable. You've got to merge the two data sets.
I would say that's worth pursuing too. I remember, I'm not out of school because I shared this with Dave Paulides a while back, but the first time I met Dr. Jim Lukatsky, he brought it up. He said he thought that there was a connection there. He didn't go into any further detail, but maybe sometimes, James, you can interview him and he can tell you what he means. But I think that's a possibility, that there's some kind of a harvest operation underway. Don't know why, but I think Dave has put together a pretty compelling pile of evidence. I haven't seen his new film yet, but I'm watching it this weekend.
Same here. I've been waiting to watch it. I'm going to watch it this weekend. And I got that question from one of our mutual colleagues specifically for you, Colm. So interesting. And okay, this is something that comes up, and both of you are friends, are colleagues with Robert Bigelow. And this is something he has brought up on several occasions. I put together a little video collage of different people talking to the issue of the phenomenon in some way, shape, or form, whether it's through, these different words we can use that have baggage, which I don't want to really get into, but maybe even surrogates, right? The phenomenon walking among us. And the 60 Minutes, Robert Bigelow had said, he's laughing. It's like, it's right under everybody's noses. It's like, they're here. They're walking among us. George.
Yeah, I have to agree with him. I don't have any evidence of it, but there are some pretty compelling cases that have come my way. I'm thinking back to Ingo Swann.
Yes. Yeah. Penetration.
Of seeing beings that are not us walking around in grocery stores, I think was what Ingo had.
Yeah.
I think that's probably true. I don't know how you document that. If they don't want to be seen, they're not seen. So I'm open to the possibility.
Colm?
Well, I mean, I think everybody has read Nick Redfern's books on these men in black and the black-eyed kids, and I mean, there's a whole bunch of different lore out there. We, again, with NIDS especially, we had a lot of people coming forward and relaying these kinds of stories to us, but we never looked at it in any meaningful way. The fact that entities or they, quote unquote, they are walking among us doesn't necessarily mean they're visible. I mean, when we were on the when we were on Skinwalker Ranch, there were I would say a handful of occasions when I was 100% certain that within 5 feet or maybe 10 feet of me, something was standing there, because I could feel it, I could see it staring, or I could feel it staring at me. And this was not sort of something that happened all the time. And these were standout occasions for me when something was that I couldn't see was standing very close to me, and something that smelled. I got odor evidence also that it was not smelling very nicely. But that's an example of something walking among us. It's just that we can't see it, and I would totally support that. There's an awful lot in our environment. A lot of the anecdotal stuff that we gathered at NIDS and in some cases AAWSAP showed that in the infrared area of the spectrum, that there was a lot of activity that we were not able to see with our visible eye beyond 900 nanometers. I mean, once you go beyond 900 nanometers and you're using infrared technology or night vision technology, you can gather a lot more data. But in terms of walking among us, yes.
There were some dramatic incidents, James, at the ranch that we talked about in Hunt for the Skinwalker, and also in the follow-up, the Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, things that happened at the ranch that were in the invisible spectrum that maybe your listeners would remember. The something went up the telephone pole and ripped the hell out of a camera, did it invisible. Right. It happened, but it did it invisibly. There were cases where the rancher recalls seeing something moving through water, displacing water. It was a physical in that sense, but it was invisible. There were times when it would walk through its cattle and disperse the cattle. Something physical that was real that you couldn't see. Scary. Yeah.
Well, and really to tie that back to the UFO thing, I mean, I've seen it on hundreds of occasions, and many hundreds of thousands of people across the world. These UFOs, they seem to come in and out of reality at will, not just shooting off like that's talked about in the Nimitz, but actually dematerializing, rematerializing. This is something, and not even just physical craft, which seem to do that, but orbs, right? And whether that's some kind of organic intelligence, whether that's some kind of technology that's beyond what we can currently understand, there's so many ways to look at it. And I really like how Robert Bigelow put it in your interview with him, George, on Mystery Wire, when he said that there's a physical nuts and bolts presence that people feel kind of safe with, and then there's the presence aspect of it, of they're among us, whether they can have surrogates, and then you get into things like hybrids that people are going to get torn up about, but whether they can interact through people, or that's a whole nother thing. But I'm glad you guys were able to speak to it. And one more question for you. I'll start with George. Maybe only George can address this. What you mentioned, those 4 programs that may see the light of day, or Jeremy was the original attributor of that comment, and then you kind of supported it. Is it possible that one of those 4 programs is involved with what we understand as Zodiac?
I'm not sure. I'm honestly not sure. I'm not sure that I would call Zodiac. My understanding of it is pretty limited. I'm not sure I'd call that a program. It's more of an organization, and I think they have fingers in a lot of different pies, but I'm not sure that it is an actual program in a sense that it's funded and there's a formal structure for it. So sorry, I can't answer that for you.
Sure. But do you think we'll ever see anything on Zodiac in the near future?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's entirely possible. Yeah.
Oh, so, and, I want to thank you guys so much for your time. Getting to speak with you guys is like, again, it's on my bucket list, talking to George Knapp, Colm Kelleher, some of the greatest in this field, and will definitely go down in history. But I just want to bring up for the audience and for you guys, George, I know I sent it to you, President Barack Obama, they just announced on Netflix that there's a series coming, a film where the Obama's production company, it's called, High something media. And it's on the official Netflix page that they're producing a film on the Betty and Barney Hill abduction case. Set to do, and I'll send you guys the link. George, I sent it to you this morning. It's official. It's going to come out in 2024. I actually sent it to Jim, and he said, yeah, it's legit. So
I'm glad that President Obama has seen the light, because I've got a little stack in my piles of stuff here at home, stack of some newspaper headlines where he was pretty hostile to UFOs and aliens and things of that sort. We have absolutely no evidence, the White House said. So
I remember that. I remember when the inquiry was put forward to the petition, and they said, oh, we don't know anything about it. But yet actually last year, he said UAPs are real. There's things that we don't understand, and they're out there, and we're tracking them, and we're trying to understand them. So kudos to him for that. He made the funny comments of like the alien overlords won't let me say anything. That was kind of a joke, but I think he is somebody who may be interested in it. And again, there was a campaign thing just 2 months ago, and he included the talk about the UAP report, and it was kind of a joke, but it wasn't in a negative connotation.
Well,
So
maybe he's
that-
ticked off that he didn't get briefed or something.
right, just like Bill Clinton.
He was inside. Colm and I are happy to sit him down and knock his socks off if you talk to him, James.
Yeah, right. Or get Kate to do the briefing, or Hal, right? Just do the sit down. I hope there's progress in that area, but that's telling that that's going on. You know, we got this the transcript is available now for the roundtable thing. We're expecting the report very soon to the public version. So I'm optimistic about that. I think we still have quite a ways to go. I'm very excited for next year because of the language and the whistleblower immunity. I'm concerned about what will make it to the public, but people that operate in that world have said the cavalry is coming. They're optimistic. And one more thing, George, have you got a read on potential whistleblowers coming forward?
Yes. Yeah. I have a small list that I know are people who are ready to come forward. I know I mentioned earlier, I teased the idea that I wouldn't be surprised that they heard something very recently. I can tell you for sure that they did. That happened. It's already happened, and more will be coming. I'm excited about that. But again, I would just tell your listeners, diligence. It's all about diligence. The public has to stay engaged with this to keep Congress's feet to the fire so they stay on top of the Pentagon, because they will kill this if they get the chance to do it.
Do you have an idea of a number of the amount of whistleblowers that could potentially come forward?
I know of 5. I know 5 names.
And those, do you know what kind of background they operate in? Is it military? Is it intelligence? Is it aerospace?
Intelligence.
Okay. And man, I could talk to you guys forever again. Just is there anything that we should be anticipating that you guys are working on? Is there going to be a Skinwalkers in the Pentagon Part 2? And if there is, it's got to be narrated by you, George. I was waiting for your voice. You got the best voice in the business.
Well, since the book came out, we've been working on a film version, put it that way. I've been recording interviews with some pretty amazing people. I don't know where that's going to land. I think it's probably more of a series than a film. It might be a film series, but it's a lot of stuff that we've been working on. And then, of course, the Skinwalkers at the Pentagon barely touched the surface of what Colm and those guys worked on in AAWSAP. I mean, James, you cannot believe the kinds of reports they put together. Even the original Tic Tac investigations, hundreds of pages, that has not been duplicated as far as I know. And we, it took us 14 months to get the approval for that book. There's so much more of that story to be told. I'd like to spill it all, but Colm is a cruel taskmaster and keeps me in line.
Well, hey, Colm, George, if one of you guys want to read me in, I'm more than open.
Well, one thing I can say is that we've had a lot since Skinwalkers at the Pentagon has come out. We've had a lot of requests for the audiobook. And, I can say, like, in January, the audiobook is going to be released. But, there's been a lot of emails and talk or requests for an audiobook. So if people are interested, it will be coming out in January.
And it's not going to be George, right? I wish, George, you gotta do something, because Whitley Strieber just put out Communion, a new edition where he narrated, which is incredible. Whitley Strieber here is just at one of our events too. Again, I'd love to stay in touch. I really want to continue this conversation with you guys sometime soon. Again, it's an honor to speak to you, and I'm honored to be amongst these kind of people like yourself, George and Colm, and trying to take this on. I'm sure for people like us, it's a mission. You can't put it down if you know. So
James,
thank you.
You're doing good work, man. We look forward to seeing you at one of your events one of these days.
Yeah. You guys
I appreciate talking with you. It was great.
Yeah, you guys are welcome as guests to any of our events, and we're definitely going to have you there as speakers at one of the upcoming ones. I hope. If you guys could get put in a word for me for Jim Lakatsky for coming on here, I'd really appreciate that. I'd love to talk with him. But again, thank you so much, guys, and I'll speak to you guys soon.
All right.
Thank you, James.
All good.